Aloha from Hawaii. I am really excited to get a chance to talk to you about a magnificent ocean resource that can be used to generate most of the electricity that is required by humanity. The first written documentation of the existence of this resource I found in a novel that was written 150 years ago called 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by a French author, where he describes the effect that I'm going to try to show to you today. It wasn't until 11 years later that was actually tried in France by one of the first inventors. And then it lay dormant for a few years till after World War I, when another French inventor tried the system of Cuba first, and then of Brazil. He had difficulty showing that it really worked, mostly because of the equipment available at the time. So since have of course progressed a lot in the last 70 years, then OTEC was restarted by the United States in the late 1970s, early 1980s, due to the situation with OPEC throughout the world. And most of the work was centered around Hawaii, the US work. You can see here Hawaii, what we call the leeward side. And I was really fortunate in that I was hired to lead a team that actually designed and installed an experimental plant in Hawaii that we operated for 5 years. It was really magnificent. Even though I have a lot of academic training, I would never cease to be amazed by almost the magic of being able to generate electricity by using the ocean water. And the way it works is in a way pretty simplistic, but it is what we engineers call a heat engine. For a heat engine, you need a heat source and a heat sink, we call it. Think of a steam engine, for example. In this case, the heat source is the temperature of the surface water around equatorial waters. And the heat sink is the temperature of the water from depths of 500 to 1,000 meters. Now, this water that is at those depths is generated in the poles and to what we call the thermohaline circulation. So the water is always there, and it's roughly between 4 and 5.5, 6 degrees Celsius. Doesn't vary much. While at the surface, the water will vary throughout the year. For example, in the plant that I operate in Hawaii, was between 24 and 28 degrees Celsius, most of the time 26. Now, of course, this resource is not available everywhere, but I would like to show you in this chart that was put together by a dear colleague of mine that happens to be French, Gerard News, from the University of Hawaii. It shows color-coded the temperature difference between 20-meter depth and 1,000 meters depth. The redder the color is, the better the temperature source is. As you can see, for example, right off Central America, right off Mexico, you see a really considerable resource. Then you can jump here to off Brazil, another considerable resource. Then throughout the Southeast Asia, going around to the other side, you can see the results basically everywhere. When I began to work on this, we have to, of course, rely on existing technologies from the offshore engineering companies, and we felt that we needed to be within 10 to 20 kilometers from the shoreline to be able to implement this idea. And that's why we concentrated in Hawaii in the case of the US. But since then, in the last 40 years, there has been such an expansion of offshore engineering that there's now better knowledge as to what we can do. For example, just to give you an idea of what is being planned throughout the world, is considering the situation in England, for example. As you can see in this chart, England, of course, up here doesn't have the thermal resource. But here in Morocco, there's plenty of sunshine. So the British are in the process, really ongoing, installing a photovoltaic arrays, and they're going to send via submarine power cable all the way from Morocco to England the electricity that they're going to generate in Morocco. And that cable is so long that it's equivalent to about 30 degrees of latitude. So it's like saying the cable will go like from here to there in this scale right here. So that tells me if I can take that cable now and I can put it like here, for example, I can then have access to mainland China and provide the electricity that mainland China needs. Another exciting location is the case of Australia here, because as we all know, Australia has a significant coal resource and they want to continue exploiting that. But if they could have as an alternative ocean thermal energy conversion, they would be able to leave the coal resource in the ground instead of having to use it to meet their needs. Now, also, we have proven that the technology works 24 hours a day, 7 days out of the week, all year long. We have proven that it is renewable as long as the sunshine is there. But of course, if you begin to extract a lot of that thermal energy from the ocean, things are going to change. So what was done at the University of Hawaii under Dr. News, my dear friend Gerard News, was to come up with a really sophisticated computer model, the kind that you can run in your laptop, that includes ocean atmospheric interactions, includes the thermohaline circulation. And what he could do is set up OTEC plants throughout what we call the thermal resource that you can see in this chart once more, this whole area here. And he put enough plants to tens of thousands of plants all at once to see what will happen to the environment. Now, the conclusion was that we could generate as much as half of the energy required by humanity utilizing this ocean thermal energy. But now, of course, that was done in the computer and we instantaneously turn on all the plants at once in the computer. But if this were to be implemented, or when it is implemented, it will be one plant at a time. So we'll be able to monitor what are the effects on the environment to really make sure that it's indeed environmentally benign. But the beauty of this, and that never ceases to amaze me, is that we're able to produce electricity, and by the way, also desalinated water, without any CO2 emissions. So this is carbon-free energy, and it is renewable, and it is available 24 hours a day, unlike wind or solar, for example. So it's really exciting to consider the possibility of implementing this worldwide and be able to help many, many countries move away from utilizing fossil fuels and therefore the CO2 emissions. As you know, right now, we're speaking in Glasgow, there are almost 200 countries represented. And one of the many topics discussed is that we, humanity, need to keep 90% of the coal resources in the ground and about 60% of the petroleum fuel and natural gas resources in the ground. That's a huge requirement. But I believe that at least theoretically, we could meet that by implementing OTEC worldwide. Now, the matter is then, okay, great. You guys know that the resource is there. You have proven that you can actually generate electricity. But how about the cost? What will be the cost of doing something like that? So what I would like to show you is a couple more slides, if you allow me. Here. Now, first, just to remind you, these are the plants that I was fortunate enough to operate in Hawaii. And we demonstrated that it really works 24/7, as I told you before. And now we try to find out whether or not it was technically feasible to implement this. So we rely on designs that the one shown on the left-hand side was a design that I implemented with a magnificent British company from London, actually. On the bottom slide, I show you how one of these vessels that will house the OTEC power plant can survive really extreme environmental conditions, extreme waves and winds, like the one shown there, with a platform that is being used by the oil companies to store either natural gas or petroleum. So we have the technology, we have the equipment that we're required to do this. But now, of course, the next question would be, how about the cost? Now, briefly in this graph, what I'm trying to show, and I implemented this in the 1990s and I kept updating it every 10 years, but I gave up in 2009 because the message hasn't changed. This shows how much money you will need to implement a power plant, and this shows the size of the plant. And it's what we call an economy of scale. So you have to get to these larger plants, 90 to 100 megawatt plants. to be able to really begin to be competitive with standard technologies that we have today using petroleum fuels. Mind you, in the case of Hawaii, for example, with 1 million people, we need 10 plants at 100 megawatt each to be able to satisfy all the needs for Hawaii. So it is doable. But of course, the cost of the electricity is really dependent on what kind of loans you can get. And what I'm trying to show in here is that whether you get a commercial loan or a government bond loan with a certain interest rate and for a certain number of years. So we talk about what we call the levelized cost. And by that, we mean how much do I need to charge per unit of electricity for me to be able to recover the investment and be able to cover all the cost. And that's what I'm trying to show there. So by the time we get to the 50, 100 megawatt size plant, we feel comfortable we should be able to compete with existing technologies. This says nothing about the future. This is nothing about the cost of trying to stop the use of fuels that emanate CO2 into the atmosphere. Now, let's perhaps you allow me to summarize the situation. What we have learned as of today. From the technical perspective, we have shown repeatedly, and by the way, by we, I mean us here in the US, in Hawaii specifically, some wonderful colleagues in South Korea that have also trying to implement this technology, friends in Japan, and they have a small plant, experimental plant in Okinawa. Then some colleagues continue doing work here in Hawaii with these experimental plants. But the reality is that an engineer like myself that spent so many years thinking about this and being lucky enough to work on this, we really don't learn anything new from the experimental plants. However, they're extremely important because I could never forget years ago, I was given a tour of the plant that I operated in Hawaii to a high official from the Department of Energy. And I remember when he got off the rental car to come and see the plant, as we were walking towards the plant, he said, "Oh my Lord, there's no smokestack." I could never forget that because in those simple terms, he reminded me of the fact that we don't emanate any pollution into the atmosphere by making electricity this way, generating electricity this way. That was pretty exciting to see that. And then when we began to produce desalinated water, we set up a little water fountain. So we'll have these officials come to visit and we'll have them drink the water. And that really was extremely important. I'm saying that because even though, a guy that's been looking at this for so long like myself, really not much that I can learn from experimental plants anymore. I already did all the learning. But on the other hand, though, when somebody sees an experimental plant working, another official told me that that plant was worth 1,000 reports because he could see it, he could touch it, he could drink the water, and then he could actually monitor the gauge that show how much electricity was being produced. So it's really important to maintain that. Now, regarding the technology itself, do we need to really any major breakthroughs to be able to implement any technical breakthroughs? And I think the answer is no, really, because between the experimental plants and all the advances in the last 20 years by the offshore engineering, it's amazing what has been learned with submarine power cables that extend over 3,000 kilometers, land power cables that go over 2,500 kilometers. So it will be possible to implement OTEC and have the electricity transmitted via submarine power cables and then land cables throughout even the United States, for example, not just Hawaii or the Gulf of Mexico. So that's the technical aspect, okay? So we can be happy with that. But now how about the economic aspects? We have determined that we have to get to the 50 to 100 megawatt size plants. Remember, we need 10 100 megawatt plants to be able to satisfy the needs of 1 million people in Hawaii, to give an idea of the dimensions involved. But how do we get there when we only have these small plants that are not even a megawatt at this point, or 100, the size of what we consider to be a commercial plant? And that is, of course, a challenge. So we think that we need to find a way to at least implement some plan that is close to that size to be able to demonstrate that it can really be economical. Now, how about the environmental effects? We don't have enough plants operating to be able to really determine what would the effects be to the ocean. However, we do know what it is that we need to monitor because, as you know, we take the water from the ocean, the water goes through the plant, and then we have to put it back into the ocean. We make sure we put it back below what is called the photic layer, so we don't affect the primary production of protein in the world. But we have determined with a numerical model, the most sophisticated model that is available, that we could be as much as half the worldwide energy consumption today, and it might be acceptable, but we need to, of course, begin to implement plans and begin to perform measurements to really make sure that's the case. Now, how about the political situation now? Unfortunately, this requires government, or what I call angel patient financing, especially the word patient there, because you want to see a return on investment for a few years, because you need to purchase the components, install them, operate the plant, and that provides to be really challenging. So that is really the last remaining issue: is how do we get financing